What drives a man to cross borders to fight a war he claims he never wanted? Pyotr Kravtsov sits across from his interviewer, a man caught between two worlds. He's a soldier, a title that should imply honor, sacrifice, loyalty. And yet, here he is, a prisoner in a foreign land, shackled by questions he can't quite answer. As he speaks, he recalls his life before the war, a life filled with familiar routines, family gatherings, friends from his small town. But now, those memories are distant, tangled with the violence he's witnessed, and perhaps even caused. In his own account, Pyotr casts himself as a reluctant fighter, someone driven by a sense of duty, loyalty to his people, and a desire to protect. He speaks with a calm, almost solemn tone, describing his decision to join the military as one rooted in responsibility. "I didn't want war," he says, his gaze steady but distant. "I wanted to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. It was my duty." He insists on this version of events, portraying himself as a man caught up in something larger than himself, a protector, not an aggressor. But this image, the story he tells of himself, is far from complete. The reality is that Pyotr crossed a border into a country that did not ask for his protection. To Ukrainians, he's an invader, someone who arrived uninvited, weapon in hand. To them, his protection meant disruption, fear, and destruction. In their eyes, he came not to shield but to control, not to defend but to occupy. As Pyotr's narrative unfolds, the interviewer begins to press him, drawing out the cracks in his story. The contrast between his words and his actions grows starker with each sentence. He describes marching through Ukrainian villages, the silent streets, the looks from wary civilians. He recalls encounters with people who looked at him not with gratitude but with resentment and fear. And yet, even now, he struggles to see himself through their eyes, clinging to the belief that his presence was justified. Pyotr's voice wavers slightly as he continues, as though he too senses the weight of these contradictions. His story, a tale of duty and honor in his own mind, is one of invasion and violence to others. In this quiet moment of captivity, he confronts a reality he's been avoiding. He is not the noble figure he wants to be, but a soldier caught up in an unjust war, a war he claims to never have wanted, yet chose to fight in all the same. The silence between his words stretches as he wrestles with this image, grappling with the fading illusions of righteousness that once drove him. Here, far from home and under scrutiny, he is forced to face the undeniable truth. He may have seen himself as a protector, but to the world beyond his own mind, he is an invader. Pyotr sits up straight, his hands folded tightly, as he begins to weave the story of his motivations. He describes his call to arms as a duty bound by loyalty, not just to his country, but to a broader idea of kinship. Brotherhood, he calls it. In his mind, crossing the border wasn't a violation, but an act of solidarity. He explains that he felt a deep obligation to protect Russian-speaking Ukrainians, people he saw as his own, who he believed were under threat. It wasn't about politics, Pyotr insists, his tone steady, rehearsed. It was about standing up for our own, defending our brothers and sisters who couldn't defend themselves. His words carry a ring of conviction, a script he's told himself many times over. To him, this war was less about territories and more about honor, a mission to defend those he perceived as family, in a land he considered linked by blood and history. He recounts stories of his comrades, men he grew close to in training, men he considered brothers, bound together by shared purpose. But as Pyotr speaks, the interviewer's silence is as sharp as any question. He lets Pyotr paint this picture of noble duty, then leans in and asks, almost casually, "Pyotr, did anyone in Ukraine ask for this protection?" The words hang in the air, and Pyotr's expression shifts. It's as if he hadn't fully considered this perspective. He falters, then replies, "They needed us. They didn't know it, but they did. I saw what they were going through. I couldn't just stand by." The interviewer presses on, the tone shifting from probing to almost incredulous. "So you felt it was your responsibility to enter their towns, armed, with no invitation. You believed that you had the right to decide what was best for people you'd never met, in a country you'd never lived in." Pyotr opens his mouth, searching for words, but the clarity of his initial conviction begins to wane. The once definite lines of duty and loyalty he spoke of now seem blurred, tangled with questions of choice, power, and intrusion. The interviewer doesn't let up, and Pyotr's polished story starts to fray, piece by piece. "I'm not saying I wanted to intrude," Pyotr says hesitantly. "But when you're called, when you feel it in your gut that people need you, you act. You don't question. But is that how brotherhood works, Pyotr? The interviewer interrupts. Or is that how occupation begins? Are you protecting, or are you controlling? For a moment, Pyotr's face falls into a troubled silence. This was not a perspective he had entertained. To him, every action had been justified, driven by a pure purpose. But now, under the interviewer's scrutiny, he starts to see his actions through a different lens. What he once believed was a mission of brotherhood begins to look more like a campaign of authority imposed on those who had no say. The interviewer continues, calmly dissecting Pyotr's account. You say you felt an obligation, a calling, he remarks, his voice calculated and piercing. But was it obligation, or was it obedience? Loyalty to whom, Pyotr? To the people you claim to protect, or to those who sent you there? The question strikes Pyotr hard. He shifts in his seat, grappling with the dissonance between the version of himself he wants to believe in and the reality of his choices. He begins to offer justifications, repeating phrases about duty and nationalism. But each attempt sounds weaker than the last, as if even he can hear the hollow ring of his words. As the interviewer watches, Pyotr's certainty begins to falter, inch by inch. What began as a tale of duty and noble cause now lies in fragments, riddled with questions he can no longer ignore. For the first time, he appears vulnerable, his self-assured narrative cracking under the weight of doubt. And in that silence, a tension grows. The story he once held up as honorable is beginning to collapse, leaving only the uncomfortable truth. He crossed borders not to protect, but to obey. His sense of brotherhood may have been nothing more than a facade, a justification that masked his role in an act far removed from heroism. The conflict that brought Pyotr Kravtsov to Ukraine didn't begin with his decision to enlist. It was a conflict shaped by years of tension, by borders drawn and redrawn, by centuries of shared history tangled in language, identity, and ideology. The Russian government had long portrayed the war as a necessary measure, a mission to protect ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking communities within Ukraine. It was a narrative repeated often, a justification that Pyotr says he internalized, a call to arms he felt he couldn't ignore. When Pyotr speaks of his enlistment, his voice is calm, almost detached, as if it were inevitable. He describes the choice as one born out of duty and loyalty, of aligning himself with a cause bigger than himself. I joined because it felt like the right thing to do, he says, his gaze fixed on some distant point. There were people suffering. It was my job to stand with them. But the interviewer doesn't let the statement sit unchallenged. Suffering? He asks, his tone skeptical. Or were you told they were suffering? Did you see it for yourself, Pyotr, or did you just believe what they told you? Pyotr shifts uncomfortably, but he presses on with his story. He describes his journey to Ukraine, the bus ride to the border, the cold silence in the air as they crossed into a country where he'd never set foot, yet somehow felt entitled to protect. His words paint a picture of certainty, a belief that his presence was necessary, even righteous. But beneath his calm demeanor, the doubts start to emerge, brought to light by the interviewer's pointed questions. Did you think, even for a moment, that maybe they didn't need you? The interviewer asks, that maybe you were bringing them exactly the suffering you'd come to prevent? The question lingers, and for a moment, Pyotr is silent. The narrative he had told himself, that he was part of a just cause, a defender of the vulnerable, begins to blur. His journey, once so filled with conviction, now seems less like a mission of peace and more like a path paved with assumptions and blind loyalty. Pyotr leans forward, his gaze steady as he recounts his reasons for enlisting. For him, it wasn't a question of ambition or personal gain. He claims it was a calling, a duty he felt bound to fulfill. I went because they needed us, he begins, his voice carrying a tone of deep conviction. Russian-speaking people, they were being persecuted, treated as outsiders in their own land. I couldn't just sit by and let it happen. The story he tells is one that he's clearly repeated before, a narrative built on the idea of loyalty, kinship, and a moral imperative. To Pyotr, this mission was rooted in history, in the shared culture and language that linked his homeland to the people in eastern Ukraine. In his mind, he was going to defend his brothers and sisters, a term he uses often, as if the very phrase solidifies his reasoning. He describes families torn apart, villages supposedly abandoned, children growing up in fear because they spoke Russian. But as he speaks, the interviewer cuts in, his voice calm yet laced with doubt. Pyotr, when you say persecuted, what does that mean, exactly? Did you see this persecution with your own eyes? Pyotr hesitates for a moment, as though the question catches him off guard. No, not personally, he admits slowly, but we heard about it all the time. In the news, from friends, from the authorities. They told us people were suffering. that they were in danger just for being who they were. We had to act. The interviewer doesn't let up. And did you ever question what you were told? Did you wonder if maybe? The story wasn't quite as simple as they made it out to be. Pyotr shifts uncomfortably, but he defends his beliefs, holding tightly to the story that led him to war. Why would they lie about something like that? He counters. These were our people, and they needed us. We had a responsibility to protect them. That's what they told us. That's what we believed. The interviewer lets the words linger for a moment before responding, his tone more probing, almost clinical. So you went to war, crossed borders, armed yourself. Based on something you heard. A story passed down, not something you saw. How could you be sure, Pyotr, that these people even wanted you there? Pyotr falters, his words coming slower now, as if he's grappling with the questions himself. He describes his training, the speeches they listened to, the briefings that painted a stark picture of Ukrainian persecution against Russians. To him, these stories were enough. Stories that made the situation seem clear, urgent, just. He was told that there was no time for questions, that the facts were simple. His people were in danger, and his presence would bring peace and protection. But the interviewer presses further. Pyotr, you speak of protection, but what does protection look like when it's delivered at gunpoint? What does peace look like when it comes in the form of an invasion? Pyotr hesitates, his brow furrowing as he struggles to articulate his thoughts. I didn't think of it that way, he says quietly, almost as if he's speaking to himself. We were just doing what we thought was right. What we were told was right. The interviewer's voice takes on a harder edge, his words cutting through Pyotr's defenses. But right for whom, Pyotr? Did you ever stop to wonder if your protection was not what these people wanted? If maybe they saw you not as a protector but as a threat? Pyotr's face tightens, his hands clenching slightly. He's silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting downward. The story he had held onto, the justification that had given him purpose, now feels fragile, as if the interviewer's questions are pulling it apart strand by strand. Maybe it wasn't as simple as I thought, he admits slowly. Maybe we didn't understand everything, but I still believe that we were doing what had to be done. Those people, they were part of us. We had a duty to protect them. The interviewer's response is measured, challenging yet calm. But isn't that the problem, Pyotr? That you decided who needed protecting, that you crossed borders based on an idea that maybe, just maybe, wasn't even true. What if, in trying to protect, you only brought them more harm? Pyotr's defenses weaken, his voice growing softer, less certain. I don't know, he says, almost to himself. I thought we were doing something good. I thought we were standing up for something real. The interviewer gives him a moment, watching as Pyotr's carefully constructed beliefs begin to falter. He finally asks, do you still believe it was right, Pyotr? Pyotr looks up, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and confusion. The once clear conviction in his voice has faded, replaced by a hesitant, almost haunted tone. I don't know. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe we were all wrong. And in that quiet admission, the facade of Pyotr's story begins to crumble. The idea of protection he once clung to now lies shattered, leaving him alone with questions he cannot answer and a truth he can no longer deny. Pyotr's voice drops as he begins to recall the moments when his confidence in the mission first began to waver. At first, he brushes off the details, speaking in general terms, trying to frame it as nothing more than the hardships of war. But as he continues, the scenes he describes start to grow more vivid, slipping past his guarded words. There were times, he says cautiously, when things didn't look the way they told us they would. We'd enter these towns, villages, places that were supposed to be grateful for our protection. He pauses, his eyes cast downward, as though revisiting something he'd rather forget. But sometimes we'd find them empty, abandoned. The people who stayed, they didn't greet us as protectors. I remember their faces, the way they looked at us. The interviewer seizes this moment. How did they look at you? Pyotr hesitates, almost unwilling to answer. Like we were the enemy, he admits quietly. They'd pull their children close, turn away from us. I thought they'd be glad to see us, relieved. But they looked afraid. It was like they hated us. The interviewer presses him, his tone relentless yet calm. And what did you do with that? Did you ask yourself why they were afraid, Pyotr? Why they looked at you that way? Pyotr doesn't respond immediately, as if the question cuts deeper than he anticipated. He stares into the distance, and a flicker of doubt crosses his face. I tried not to think about it, he says finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I told myself it was temporary, that they didn't understand why we were there. I thought maybe they'd see in time. But the interviewer doesn't let him settle in his explanation. And what about the things you saw? You say they didn't understand, but did you? Pyotr looks down, his hands twisting together, as if he's struggling to hold on to the last threads of his own narrative. Slowly, he begins to recount moments that haunted him, details he can no longer ignore. There were times, he admits, his voice thick with hesitation, when I saw things I can't explain away. He describes entering a small village, the streets eerily quiet, the homes barely standing. We thought it was empty, he says. But then, we found people. Civilians, old men, women, even children. They were hiding in basements, terrified. I didn't understand why they'd be so afraid. But then I saw some were hurt. They said it was us. The interviewer's voice is pointed, almost ruthless in its precision. And did you believe them, Pyotr? Pyotr's face contorts, caught between defensiveness and a rising sense of shame. At first. I told myself they were lying, that someone else had done this. We were there to help them. It couldn't have been us. He pauses, the words catching in his throat. But there were times, other villages, other people, all telling the same story. I couldn't ignore it forever. The interviewer leans in, his tone heavy with accusation. So when did it start to sink in, Pyotr? When did you begin to see that maybe you weren't the hero of this story? Pyotr's voice trembles, a rare vulnerability emerging. I don't know. Maybe. When I saw the children. They'd look at us, wide-eyed not with curiosity but with fear. They'd hide behind their mothers. I started to realize, if we were truly there to protect, why did they look at us like that? Why did they flinch when we approached? His voice falters as he recalls one particular moment. A boy, no older than 6 or 7, clutching his mother's leg, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. I remember. He looked at me, just stared, and then he started crying. It broke something inside me. I couldn't understand how we'd become something so terrifying to a child. The interviewer's words sliced through the silence, leaving no room for retreat. And what did you do with that feeling, Pyotr? Did you face it, or did you bury it? Pyotr's gaze drops, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. I tried to push it down, he admits, his voice hollow. Told myself it was just the stress of war, that I was overthinking. But it never went away. Every time we entered another village, every time I saw that fear, it kept coming back. The interviewer's tone grows softer, almost sympathetic, yet still carrying an edge. So you started to question the mission. But did you ever question yourself, Pyotr? Did you question your part in it? Pyotr hesitates, his face clouded with regret. I wanted to. But questioning, it wasn't allowed. We were taught to follow orders, to trust that our purpose was noble. I didn't. I didn't want to see what was really happening. But in those quiet moments, when no one was watching, I couldn't escape it. I'd see their faces, and I'd wonder, was I really doing the right thing? The silence stretches as Pyotr grapples with his words. What began as a story of pride and purpose now lies in ruins, exposed by the brutal reality of what he's seen, by the people who feared rather than welcomed him. He clings to remnants of his former certainty, yet he can no longer ignore the gaps in his beliefs, the moments when the mask slipped, revealing not a hero, but a man complicit in a war he never fully understood. Pyotr's voice shifts as he begins to recount his encounters with Ukrainian civilians, stories that range from tense standoffs to uneasy silences. He describes the different reactions he received, some people hiding behind closed doors, others daring to look him in the eye with a mixture of fear and defiance. In each story, Pyotr tries to downplay the tension, as though his presence there was routine, almost neutral. There was one village we entered, he begins, his tone flat, as though describing a common occurrence. We were stationed there for a few days, told to keep an eye out. I remember the people barely came outside. They'd watch us from behind windows, curtains pulled halfway. Some of them would just stare, like we were intruders in their home. He hesitates before adding, but we weren't there to harm them. I mean, we didn't want any trouble. The interviewer interjects, his tone carrying an edge. And what did you expect, Pyotr? You arrive in armored vehicles, guns drawn, uninvited. What reaction did you hope for? Pyotr shifts uncomfortably, as though he hadn't fully considered this question. I thought, maybe they'd understand, in time, that we were there to help keep things safe. We weren't the enemy. The interviewer's voice cuts in sharply. But is that how they saw you, Pyotr? Did you ever stop to ask yourself why they looked at you with such fear? Why a man who claims to be a protector was treated like a threat? Pyotr's expression tightens, a shadow passing over his face. He recounts another encounter, this time with an elderly man who had refused to move when the soldiers approached. He stood there. Pyotr recalls, his voice quieter. just stood in the middle of the road, staring us down. I thought maybe he'd move, but he didn't. One of the guys told him to step aside, but he just spat on the ground in front of us. The interviewer probes further. And what did you make of that, Pyotr? Did you see it as an act of defiance? Or maybe as a reaction to something deeper, something you represented? Pyotr stares into the distance, his brow furrowing. I didn't understand it then, he says slowly. I thought maybe he was just angry, stubborn. But now, looking back, maybe he saw us as the enemy. Like we didn't belong there. His voice trails off, as though grappling with a realization he doesn't want to fully acknowledge. He recalls another incident, one that unsettles him even now. There was a woman, maybe in her 30s, with 2 little kids. They were walking down the road as we were passing through. She stopped, pulled the kids close to her, and just watched us with this look, like she was ready to run if we got too close. The interviewer leans in, pressing him. And how did that make you feel, Pyotr? Seeing a mother shield her children from you, as though you were a danger to them. Pyotr's voice falters, the weight of the memory evident. I didn't want her to be afraid. I wanted to tell her we weren't there to hurt anyone. But she didn't look like she believed it. It was like, no matter what I did, I couldn't convince her we weren't a threat. The interviewer's tone hardens, not letting him off the hook. But why should she believe you, Pyotr? You're a soldier in her town, with a weapon in hand. She has no reason to trust you. Did you ever consider that maybe, to her, you were the threat? Pyotr looks down, his hands clenching and unclenching as he tries to reconcile his intentions with the civilian's reactions. I thought we were doing the right thing, he says, almost to himself. But every time I saw their faces, it was like they were reminding me that we didn't belong there. He continues, recounting moments of silent hostility, of looks exchanged without words. There was one family, he says, his voice barely above a whisper. They were watching us from their porch as we passed by. The father stood with his arm around his daughter, who couldn't have been more than 12. She stared at us, no fear, just anger, like she was daring us to come closer. I remember that look. I'll never forget it. The interviewer's voice is unyielding, almost accusing. And did you ever ask yourself what that anger was about, Pyotr? Why a child would look at you with such defiance? Pyotr hesitates, a flicker of shame crossing his face. I told myself it was because they didn't understand. That they were just confused about why we were there. But now, looking back, maybe they understood more than I did. Maybe they saw what I was too blind to see. The interviewer presses on, forcing Pyotr to confront the deeper implications of his presence. So, did you ever stop to wonder if maybe your presence there wasn't just a misunderstanding? That these people saw you for what you were, an invader? Pyotr's defenses begin to crumble as he finally admits I tried to ignore it, but there were times when I couldn't. Every look, every silent stare. It was like they were asking me, why are you here? And I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to tell them, because I didn't know myself. The silence between his words stretches, heavy and unresolved. Pyotr recounts one final encounter, one that continues to haunt him. It was a little boy, he says, his voice barely audible. He was playing in the yard when we walked by. He looked up at me and then he ran inside, calling for his mother. I heard him tell her, they're here. It was just a few words, but the way he said it, like we were something to hide from. The interviewer's voice softens, but the edge remains. And what did you feel then, Pyotr? Pyotr swallows hard, his voice thick with regret. I felt ashamed. Like
you feel present day is 5 years not felt up. Ja. Det regler ikke with the god noise. But the edge remains at the garage.
Like I was in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. Doing the wrong place, as that I was in the right curve, so that's a setup is now underneath means. Go to please no have a look. Get into the floor, clear zero whose edges of my knowledge, such a trend that have got she's to blunt checked where working is just how did that? It's fashion jet. Fresh
just better say that good Pyotr, what's your time shave that why? Maybe they saw a truth you just tease you're an hours stepped to sleep the version yaker get dishes you different showing you sweet by lost so that looks like a lot really busted must keep out when I was at reach refugees.
What began as a mission to protect has transformed into something he can no longer defend. Each face he encountered, each wary look, now serves as a reminder, a mirror reflecting a truth he cannot escape. He was not a liberator, not a protector. To those civilians, he was a symbol of everything they feared, and he's left to face the undeniable reality of what he truly was. An intruder. Pyotr shifts in his seat, a subtle tension in his posture as he begins to recount his first encounters with Ukrainian soldiers. His tone is different now, no longer calm, no longer as assured. It's as if he's reliving those moments, a shadow crossing his face as he speaks. When we first crossed the border, we were all on edge, he begins, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't there before. We were trained, we had our orders, but nothing prepares you for the first shot, for the moment you're face to face with an enemy who's just as determined as you are. He pauses, his gaze distant. They were relentless. They weren't just defending their land. They were fighting like they had everything to lose. And maybe they did. Pyotr describes the bond that quickly formed among his comrades, a camaraderie rooted in shared fear and survival. We didn't talk about it, he says, voice soft, almost reverent. But we knew. We could see it in each other's eyes. Everyone was scared, but we were there together, watching each other's backs. That was something to hold on to. He describes nights spent in hastily dug out shelters, exchanging quiet glances with the men beside him, knowing that in the morning they'd be facing the same danger, the same unknowns. The interviewer seizes the opportunity to probe deeper, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. So, Pyotr, you fought together. You supported each other. But did you ever stop to think about the people you were fighting against? The Ukrainian soldiers. Did you ever see them as more than just the enemy? Pyotr hesitates, as though he hadn't fully considered this perspective. Hey, I didn't think of them like that, he admits reluctantly. They were the enemy, but they were fighting for something too. I saw it in their eyes sometimes. When we'd cross paths, even for a moment, I'd see the same fear I felt, the same determination. They weren't so different from us. The interviewer presses him further, a faint edge of irony in his voice. So, Pyotr Okur, you saw that they were just like you, men fighting for their lives, for what they believed in. And yet, you still believed your cause was different. Did it ever strike you as strange? Pyotr's face tightens, struggling to reconcile his experiences with the story he had told himself. It wasn't easy. They were the enemy. That's what we were told. But when you're that close, you start to see them differently. You see them ducking behind walls, breathing hard, holding on to each other, the way we did. And sometimes I wondered if, in another life, we wouldn't have been on the same side. He goes on to describe one particular encounter, his voice growing softer. We were ambushed one morning. It was chaos, shots coming from everywhere, the sound echoing in my ears. I remember seeing one of them, a Ukrainian soldier, running across a field, zigzagging to avoid our fire. He stumbled just for a second, and I almost felt something. Pity, maybe, or understanding. The interviewer's voice sharpens, probing at this crack in Pyotr's resolve. Did that understanding make you stop, Pyotr? Did it make you question why you were there, why you were shooting at someone who might have been your friend in another life? Pyotr's gaze drops, his hands clenched tightly together. No, he says, voice low. In that moment, all I cared about was surviving. It was him or me. That's all I could think about. The interviewer doesn't let him retreat into that simplicity, pressing further. And what about the civilians, Pyotr? The people in those villages you passed through, the ones who got caught in the crossfire. Did you ever think about them? A flicker of discomfort crosses Pyotr's face. We didn't. We weren't supposed to focus on that. Our orders were clear. Target the enemy. Avoid collateral damage. But in a battle, things happen. You can't control every shot, every explosion. He recalls one such incident, his voice strained. There was a small village near the front lines. We were under fire, and we returned it. Later, when the dust settled, I saw there was a house, half collapsed. I don't know if anyone was inside. I didn't want to know. I told myself it was just part of the mission. that we had to protect ourselves. The interviewer leans in, his voice pointed. So you convinced yourself, Pyotr, that the destruction was justified. But did you ever consider what it was like for them, those civilians, watching their homes destroyed by men who claimed to be protectors? Pyotr's face is drawn, his gaze unfocused as he struggles with the implications. I tried not to think about it. I told myself we were there for a reason, that we were bringing something better. But every time I saw those houses, those broken windows, it got harder to believe. He recounts another memory, his voice haunted. There was a woman. She came out after one of our skirmishes, crying, clutching something close to her chest. I thought it was a child at first, but then I saw. It was a photo. A family photo, shattered glass around it. She didn't say a word, just looked at me like she was trying to understand why we'd done this. The interviewer's tone is unforgiving, his questions relentless. And what did you feel then, Pyotr? Did you feel like a protector, standing there while she held the pieces of her life in her hands? Pyotr swallows hard, his face pale. No, he says quietly, almost to himself. I didn't feel like a protector. I felt like an intruder, like I didn't belong there. The interviewer doesn't relent. So you see, Pyotr, the people you claim to protect, they weren't grateful. They weren't relieved. They were terrified, shattered, left to pick up the pieces of lives torn apart by people they never asked for. Pyotr's voice is a whisper now, raw and filled with regret. I know, he says. I know now, but then, in the heat of it, you don't think. You just follow orders. You tell yourself you're doing something important, something good. But, looking back, maybe we were the ones causing the suffering. He goes on to describe his growing sense of doubt, the nagging feeling that followed him through each encounter with Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike. Every time I looked into the eyes of a civilian or saw the face of an enemy soldier, I felt it. A pull, something that said, "You don't belong here. This isn't what you think it is." But I couldn't stop. I couldn't question it, not if I wanted to make it through. The interviewer's final question cuts to the core of Pyotr's conflict. And do you regret it, Pyotr? Do you regret fighting for something you now know wasn't what you thought it was? Pyotr's silence stretches, the weight of his answer hanging heavy in the air. Finally he speaks, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, I do. I regret everything. The people I hurt, the lives we disrupted. I can't change what happened, but I wish I'd seen it sooner. I wish I'd known. In that moment, Pyotr is no longer the soldier driven by duty or brotherhood. He is a man stripped bare of all justifications, left only with the haunting reality of his actions and the bitter taste of regret. Pyotr shifts in his seat, a shadow crossing his face as he begins to recount the day of his capture. His tone is somber, laden with the weight of that moment, a mixture of fear, resignation, and a trace of something close to relief. It happened fast, he begins, his voice low, as though reliving each second. We were on patrol, moving through an area we thought was secure. I remember. It was eerily quiet. No sounds, no movement, just silence. And then, out of nowhere, shots. Chaos. I heard my comrades shouting, running for cover. He pauses, his hand unconsciously clenching as he remembers. It all blurred together. 1 minute, we were advancing. And the next, I was alone, pinned down, nowhere to run. His voice trembles slightly as he continues. I didn't want to fight, he insists, almost as though trying to convince himself as much as the interviewer. I was just following orders. I didn't have a choice. If I hadn't done what I was told, I'd have been punished. There wasn't any other way. The interviewer seizes this moment, his tone sharp, unforgiving. No choice, Pyotr. You had no choice at all. Or was it that you chose to follow orders instead of facing the consequences of defiance? Pyotr's face tightens, the confidence in his words slipping. You don't understand, he says defensively. You're told. You're made to believe that there's only one way forward. Disobeying orders. It's not an option. We were there for a reason, and I trusted that. The interviewer leans in, his words cutting. Trusted, Pyotr? Or were you just unwilling to question, unwilling to see beyond the orders given to you? Pyotr struggles to respond, the resolve in his voice wavering. He recounts the moments after his capture, the orders he'd clung to like a lifeline, the sense of duty that had shielded him from doubt, now suddenly useless. They took my weapon, bound my hands. I remember looking around, feeling exposed, terrified. I was no longer a soldier. I was just a man, vulnerable, at their mercy. As he speaks, his voice softens, almost reflective. For the first time, I wasn't in control. I couldn't hide behind orders or my uniform. I was just a prisoner, nothing more. The interviewer's expression hardens as he probes deeper, challenging Pyotr's account of his supposed reluctance. And yet, Pyotr, even now, you frame yourself as a reluctant participant, a victim of circumstance. But what about the things you did? The things you were part of? Were those, too, beyond your control? Pyotr's face darkens, a flicker of defensiveness flaring up. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't go there to kill or harm civilians. I was there to protect. That's what we were told. I had no desire to be part of anything brutal. The interviewer's voice grows colder, each word calculated. Protect. Pyotr, you keep saying that, but let's talk about the things you actually did. The villages you went through, the civilians caught in the crossfire. Did you ever stop to consider what protection meant to them as they watched their homes burn, their families displaced? Pyotr's gaze falters, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. I didn't know. I was just following what I was told. How was I supposed to know what it was like for them? The interviewer's tone sharpens, his words piercing through Pyotr's defense. Did you ever ask? Did you ever stop to think beyond your orders, beyond your own survival? Pyotr looks away, his jaw clenched. No, he admits reluctantly. I didn't think about it. I couldn't. If I had, maybe I wouldn't have been able to do what I did. Maybe I wouldn't have made it. The interviewer presses on, mercilessly highlighting the inconsistencies in Pyotr's account. So you're saying that you chose not to see, Pyotr, that you chose to follow orders, even when those orders led to suffering. Isn't that what you're really saying? Pyotr's hands tighten on the edge of his chair, his face taut with the weight of the accusation. It wasn't that simple, he protests, his voice cracking. You don't know what it's like being there, caught between orders and survival. I wasn't a monster. I was just a soldier. The interviewer's gaze is unyielding, his tone relentless. But isn't that the point, Pyotr? You were a soldier, yes, but does that excuse what you did? Does it absolve you of responsibility? Pyotr's voice wavers, the defensiveness slipping away, leaving only a raw vulnerability. I don't know. I don't know anymore. Back then, I told myself I was doing what I had to. But now, I can't hide from what I saw. The people we left behind, the things I was part of, it's all there, in my mind, and I can't get rid of it. The interviewer doesn't let up, forcing Pyotr to confront the reality he's tried so hard to bury. So you see, Pyotr, that reluctance you claim now? It doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change the suffering left in your wake. Whether you wanted to be there or not, you were there. And you were part of it. Pyotr's shoulders sag, the fight draining out of him as the interviewer's words sink in. He recounts the interrogation that followed his capture, how he'd tried to hold on to his story, to cling to the justifications he had once believed so firmly. They asked me, over and over, why I was there. And I kept telling them the same thing: duty, loyalty, protection. But the more they asked, the harder it became to say it. He pauses, a haunted look in his eyes, because deep down, I didn't believe it anymore. Each question, each time they pushed me, I felt something breaking, like a wall crumbling. I realized that I didn't have the answers I thought I did. The things I had done, they were all there, staring back at me, and I couldn't escape. The interviewer seizes on this moment of vulnerability, his tone unrelenting. So what was it, Pyotr? Loyalty? Duty? Or fear? Fear of questioning? Fear of facing what you'd become? Pyotr's voice drops to a whisper, a hint of defeat in his tone. It was fear, he admits. I was afraid of what it would mean if I stopped following orders. If I let myself see the truth, maybe I wouldn't have been able to keep going. The interviewer's final question is like a hammer blow, driving the point home. And now, Pyotr, with no orders left to follow, with nothing left to hide behind, what do you see? Pyotr's face is pale, his expression hollow as he grapples with the answer. I see that I became something I never wanted to be, that I hurt people who didn't deserve it, and that I can't change any of it. In that moment, Pyotr is no longer the reluctant soldier, the man hiding behind duty and loyalty. He is exposed, stripped of all justifications, left to confront the brutal reality of his actions and the irrevocable harm they've caused. And in the silence that follows, he is left alone with the weight of his choices, his regrets, and a truth he can never escape. The interviewer's tone shifts, growing colder, more direct. Pyotr, he begins, his voice sharp, each word deliberate. Let's talk about the incidents in villages like Novoselivka and Mariinka. Civilians reported heavy shelling, homes destroyed, lives shattered. People said it wasn't just soldiers they were hiding from. They were hiding from something worse. Pyotr tenses, a flicker of something close to fear crossing his face. I don't know anything about that, he replies, voice unsteady. I didn't take part in anything like that. I was there to keep the peace, to protect. The interviewer doesn't let up, his words piercing through Pyotr's defenses. Protect? You keep using that word, Pyotr. But people remember soldiers storming through their streets, their homes broken by gunfire, innocent people harmed. They remember. A kind of terror you're refusing to acknowledge. Pyotr's hands tighten, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Those stories, you can't believe everything you hear. People, they exaggerate, they don't understand. We were following orders, yes, but we weren't monsters. The interviewer's voice hardens. Then explain, Pyotr. Explain the reports of indiscriminate shelling. Entire neighborhoods turned to rubble, people running for their lives. You say you're not a monster, but how do you reconcile the fact that children were found cowering in basements, hiding from the very soldiers who claimed to protect them? Pyotr's face contorts, a look of frustration mingling with something closer to desperation. We never targeted civilians, he insists, though there's a tremor in his voice. Sometimes things happened. A misfire, a mistake. We were fighting an enemy who hid among them, used them as shields. It wasn't intentional. The interviewer's expression is unyielding, his tone almost scornful. So you blame the enemy, Pyotr? You blame them for the destruction you brought into people's lives. Is that the truth, or just an excuse you're telling yourself? Pyotr's face darkens, his words coming slower now, as if each one costs him. It wasn't my choice. I didn't ask to be part of that. We were told where to go, what to do. I was following orders. The interviewer leans in, his voice a cold whisper. Orders to do what, exactly, Pyotr? To destroy homes. To take lives indiscriminately. Was that the protection you promised to these people? Pyotr looks away, his jaw clenched, the mask of control slipping. No, he mutters, almost to himself. No, that wasn't what I wanted. But sometimes things happen in war that you can't control. The interviewer presses further, refusing to let him evade responsibility. And what about specific incidents, Pyotr? A mother in Mariinka, hiding with her 3 children in a basement. Said soldiers opened fire on homes as they advanced. Her son, a boy no older than 10, was wounded in the crossfire. She remembers his scream, the terror in his eyes. What do you have to say to her? Pyotr's face pales, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't know. I didn't see. We were under fire ourselves. It wasn't intentional. None of us wanted that to happen. The interviewer's gaze is icy, his voice relentless. But it happened, Pyotr. To that mother, to that boy, and to dozens of others who were left with nothing but memories of fear and loss. You were there, in that village. You saw the aftermath. Are you telling me you never questioned what you were doing, even when you saw the destruction with your own eyes? Pyotr's voice falters, his usual justifications crumbling. I tried not to think about it. I told myself it was part of the fight, that it wasn't my fault. But those images, they stay with you. The crying, the blood, it doesn't go away. The interviewer's words cut through the silence, each one like a blade. So you saw the harm, the devastation. And yet, you kept going, kept following orders. What does that make you? Pyotr's head drops, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know, he says, voice barely a whisper. I don't know, he says, a tremor in his voice. I thought I was doing something good, something right. But now I don't know. The interviewer shifts tactics, his tone cold, almost clinical. And what about the incident near Novoselivka? Villagers reported soldiers rounding up men, accusing them of being informants. A few of those men never returned. Families claim they were taken and executed. Were you there, Pyotr? Did you see what happened? Pyotr's face pales further, his breathing shallow. I heard rumors, he admits hesitantly. I wasn't directly involved. But I knew something happened. I heard shots. But it wasn't my place to question. I didn't know the full story. The interviewer doesn't relent, his tone merciless. Not your place to question. Men were taken from their homes, never seen again. Families left without answers, without justice. And you're telling me that wasn't your place to question? Pyotr's face is a mask of regret, his voice cracking. I was just a soldier. I wasn't in charge. I followed orders because that's all I knew. If I had stopped to question, maybe I wouldn't have been able to keep going. The interviewer's voice is thick with disdain. So you kept going, Pyotr, kept ignoring the cries, the suffering, the reality of what you were doing. All because you chose to follow orders, to close your eyes to the truth. Do you still think that makes you innocent? Pyotr's silence speaks volumes, a raw vulnerability on his face. No, he says finally, his voice breaking. I know it doesn't. I know that I can't excuse what happened. I was part of it. I can't deny that. The interviewer watches him, his gaze hard, unyielding. And what would you say to those families now, Pyotr? The ones who lost loved ones, who were left with nothing but grief and broken memories. Do you even have words for them? Pyotr swallows, his expression stricken, guilt etched deeply into his face. I don't know what I could say. Nothing I say will bring them back, will undo what happened. I don't expect forgiveness. I wish I could go back. I wish I could change it. The interviewer lets the silence settle, heavy and oppressive. Finally, he speaks, his tone almost soft, but with an edge that cuts deeply. But you can't go back, Pyotr. You can't undo what's been done. And now, all that's left are the memories of those you've hurt, and the reality of your own choices, the war you chose to be part of. Pyotr's face is hollow, his voice little more than a whisper. I see that now. I see that my choices, my obedience, it didn't save anyone. It only brought pain. And I have to live with that. I have to live with it. What I became. In that moment, Pyotr's defenses crumble entirely, leaving him exposed, stripped of all pretenses, the reality of his actions, the harm, the suffering, the shattered lives, settles around him like a weight he will never be able to escape. And as the interviewer watches, it becomes clear that Pyotr's battle is no longer with an enemy, but with the man he has become, and the moral ruin he can never undo. Pyotr begins speaking, trying to piece together a narrative that, in his mind, paints him as someone who simply did what he had to in order to survive. He recounts his time on the front lines, talking about the dangers he faced, the chaos, the orders that came down from superiors with little room for questions. He speaks of himself almost as a passive observer, someone swept up in a machine far larger than himself. I didn't make the decisions, he says, his tone calm, his words deliberate. I followed orders. We all did. It was the only way to survive. If you didn't follow the chain of command, you'd be seen as a liability, a problem. The interviewer watches him closely, his expression a mix of skepticism and sharp focus. But Pyotr, he interjects, your story doesn't add up. You keep saying you didn't have a choice, that you weren't responsible for what happened. And yet, you were there. You saw the impact of your actions, and you kept going. Pyotr shifts uncomfortably, his gaze dropping for a moment. I didn't see everything. I didn't know what was happening in every village, in every town. I was just doing my part, trying to keep my head down. The interviewer leans forward, pressing him further. But you described civilians hiding in basements, families displaced, homes destroyed. You saw those things, Pyotr. You saw the devastation up close, and yet you act as if it was happening in some distant place, as if you were detached from it all. Pyotr's face tightens, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. I didn't. I wasn't the one making those decisions. I was following orders. We were told that the civilians would be fine, that they would be safe if they stayed out of the way. The interviewer's tone sharpens. Safe, Pyotr? Do you honestly believe that? Safe from the very soldiers who were storming through their villages, from the shells that tore their homes apart? How could you think they'd be safe in the middle of a war zone? Pyotr's words falter, his voice growing quieter. That's what we were told. That we were there to restore order, to bring peace to people who needed us. The interviewer's expression shifts to one of disbelief, his tone laced with irony. Peace, Pyotr? Is that really what you call it? Villages turned to rubble, families forced to flee, lives torn apart. Does that sound like peace to you? Pyotr's shoulders sag, his defenses weakening as he grapples with the contradictions laid bare before him. I didn't want that, he says quietly. I thought we were helping. But maybe I was wrong. The interviewer seizes on this moment of vulnerability, refusing to let Pyotr retreat into his justifications. So you're admitting that you saw what was happening, that you knew the harm being done, and yet you continued, telling yourself it was all for some greater purpose. How do you reconcile that? Pyotr's face contorts, a flash of frustration crossing his features. What was I supposed to do? He snaps, his voice rising. Walk away. Abandon my unit. I didn't have that luxury. None of us did. The interviewer's gaze is cold, his words cutting through Pyotr's anger. So that's it then? You stayed because it was easier to follow orders than to face the truth. Because walking away would mean admitting that you were complicit. Pyotr's mouth opens, but no words come out. He stares at the interviewer, struggling to find a response, yet knowing deep down that there is none. Finally, he speaks, his voice almost pleading. You don't understand. You weren't there. You didn't feel the pressure, the fear. It's easy to judge from the outside. The interviewer's voice is steady, unyielding. I may not have been there, Pyotr, but I'm here now. And what I see is a man who keeps shifting his story, who can't keep his narrative straight. 1 minute you were following orders out of duty, the next you claim ignorance. Which is it, Pyotr? Were you an unwilling participant, or were you turning a blind eye to protect yourself? Pyotr's face tightens, caught between defensiveness and the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Maybe I was both. Maybe I didn't want to see the full picture because if I did, I wouldn't have been able to keep going. The interviewer's expression softens, but his words remain pointed. And do you think that makes you innocent, Pyotr? Do you think that changes the reality of what happened? Pyotr's voice drops, his gaze fixed on the floor. No, he whispers, almost to himself. It doesn't. I know that. But I don't know how to live with it. The interviewer lets the silence settle for a moment before continuing, his tone calm but piercing. Do you see now, Pyotr, that these contradictions, your need to defend yourself, to frame yourself as a bystander, they don't hold up under scrutiny? They crumble under the weight of reality. Because the truth is you were there, and you played a part, whether you wanted to or not. Pyotr's hands are trembling now, his face pale as he confronts the dissonance in his own narrative. I know, he says, voice breaking. I know that I tried to hide behind excuses, that I told myself stories to make it easier. But those stories, they don't change anything. The interviewer watches him intently, allowing Pyotr's words to hang in the air. So what does that mean, Pyotr? What do these stories, these justifications, really amount to? Pyotr closes his eyes, a look of pain etched deeply into his face. Nothing, he says finally. They amount to nothing. They were just ways to cope. Lies I told myself so I wouldn't have to see what I'd become. The interviewer's final words are delivered softly, almost like a whisper. And now that you see it, Pyotr, now that you can't hide from the contradictions, what's left? Pyotr opens his eyes, his gaze hollow, empty. What's left is the truth. That I was part of something I can't take back. That I hurt people who didn't deserve it. And no amount of excuses will ever change that. In that moment, Pyotr's story unravels completely, the carefully constructed facade collapsing under the weight of his own words. What began as a narrative of duty, of following orders, now lies exposed as a hollow attempt to shield himself from the reality of his own actions. He is left, finally, with the undeniable truth, a truth he can no longer escape. Pyotr begins to speak, his voice hesitant as though searching for a way to reassert some sense of justification. Not everyone saw us as the enemy, he says cautiously, as if testing the words. There were people, Ukrainian civilians, who welcomed us. They understood what we were doing, that we were there to protect them. Some of them were grateful, I remember. A few of them even thanked us. He glances at the interviewer, as if looking for confirmation, but he's met with a silent, unreadable stare. Pyotr shifts uncomfortably and continues, his voice a bit firmer. In some places, people saw the need for what we were doing. They were tired of the conflict, tired of feeling left behind. We were helping them. Hoping to bring stability, to protect their interests. Not everyone wanted to fight us. The interviewer finally breaks his silence, his voice carrying a tone of skepticism that cuts through Pyotr's narrative. And who were these people? Pyotr. People who welcomed you, who thanked you. Or is this simply another story you're telling yourself to feel justified? Pyotr's face darkens, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. I know what I saw, he insists. There were those who wanted us there, who saw us as a stabilizing force. They were grateful that we were, willing to protect them from what they saw as chaos. The interviewer's gaze remained steady, unwavering. But were they truly grateful? Pyotr. Or were they simply trying to survive in the only way they could, by placating the men with guns who had entered their towns uninvited? Maybe. They weren't thanking you because they supported you, but because they feared you. Pyotr falters, his confidence slipping. That's not how I saw it, he stammers. I thought they understood that we weren't there to hurt them. The interviewer leans forward, his words pointed, relentless. Understood. Pyotr, Or were they just doing whatever they could to protect their families, to avoid becoming collateral damage? Did you ever stop to think that maybe, just maybe, these civilians welcomed you because they felt they had no choice? Pyotr's face tightens, as if the words have struck a nerve. "You're twisting it," he says, his voice strained. "I know there were people who supported us, who were tired of feeling abandoned by their own government. I'm not saying everyone felt that way, but there were those who saw us as a solution." The interviewer doesn't let up, his voice taking on a steely edge. "A solution? To what, Pyotr? To the instability your own presence created? To the fear of having armed soldiers patrolling their streets? What kind of support is it when it's born out of survival?" Pyotr's voice wavers, his self-assurance unraveling. I didn't see it like that at the time. I thought we were bringing something better. But maybe it wasn't as simple as I thought. The interviewer presses on, unrelenting. "You thought it was better, but for whom, Pyotr? For the people whose lives you disrupted, whose homes you occupied? Or was it only better for those who wanted to believe they were on the right side of history?" Pyotr's face is pale, his voice barely audible. "I thought we were doing the right thing," he murmurs. "I thought that. Maybe there were people who saw things the way we did, who wanted the same security." The interviewer's tone shifts, almost sympathetic, but with an edge that digs deep. "Did you ever truly see those civilians, Pyotr? Or did you only see what you wanted to see? The few faces that didn't immediately turn away, the few voices that didn't immediately question your presence?" Pyotr's eyes fall to his hands, his expression filled with self-doubt. Maybe it was. Easier that way. Only saw what I needed to see. Maybe it was. Easier that way. The interviewer's final question pierces through the silence. "So, Pyotr, if you're willing to admit that you only saw what you wanted to see, then can you honestly say that those civilians supported you tell yourself to make it all seem justified?" Pyotr swallows hard, his voice a whisper. "I don't know. I don't know anymore. I thought I was there for a reason. But I don't know anymore. I thought I was there for a reason, but maybe that reason was only in my head." Pyotr's narrative crumbles further. The story he had clung to, of grateful civilians and welcomed soldiers, now feels hollow, exposed as a fabrication built out of self-deception and fear. He sits in silence, left only with the weight of a truth he can no longer deny. Pyotr sits quietly, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. His earlier confidence, the practiced responses, the defensive tone, all of it has faded, leaving only a man grappling with the weight of what he's done. For the first time, he appears vulnerable, cracks beginning to show in the stoic facade he'd worn like armor. The interviewer's voice is softer now, yet still unyielding. "Pyotr, you speak of duty, of loyalty, of a mission you believed in. But each of those words carries a cost that others paid, a cost that you can't undo. Do you understand what that cost was?" Pyotr's eyes flicker, a hint of pain surfacing. "I know. People were hurt," he murmurs. "I know that there were consequences. But I never wanted that. I never wanted any of it to end like this." The interviewer's voice presses on, quiet but firm. "But it did. Pyotr, people lost everything. Their homes, their loved ones, their sense of safety. All because of a mission you chose to follow. Can you honestly sit there and say that it wasn't your responsibility?" Pyotr's face tightens, his voice barely audible. I didn't think about it that way. I thought I was doing something meaningful. But now, looking back, all I see is the damage left behind. And I can't escape it." The interviewer's words slice through the silence. "No, you can't escape it. And neither can they. Those people live with that damage every day, the scars left by the decisions you made, the choices you believed were justified. Have you ever truly faced that, Pyotr?" Pyotr's shoulders sag. "Have you ever truly faced that?" Pyotr's shoulders sag, a hollow look in his eyes as he begins to speak, the words coming slowly, painfully. "I've tried to shut it out, to tell myself that it wasn't me, that I was just following orders. But there are nights when the memories come back. Faces, voices, the things I tried to forget." He pauses, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I see them sometimes, the people we left behind. The fear in their eyes, the way they looked at us as if we were something to run from. And I keep telling myself that I didn't have a choice. But maybe I did. Maybe I just didn't want to face it. The interviewer's voice is steady, his words piercing through Pyotr's confession. So you're admitting that you chose not to see, that you chose to avoid the truth because it was easier than accepting the harm you were causing. Is that what you're saying, Pyotr? Pyotr's face contorts, a mixture of guilt and frustration surfacing. I didn't want to see it, he admits, voice thick with emotion. I didn't want to believe that I was part of something so destructive. I wanted to think I was there for a reason, that I was helping. But now, I don't know what I was doing. I don't know who I became. The interviewer watches him, his expression unreadable, his tone unyielding. You became someone who closed his eyes to the truth, someone who chose to protect himself over the lives of others. And now you're left with that choice, Pyotr. You're left with the consequences. Pyotr swallows, his hands clenched tightly as he continues. I thought, if I kept going, if I just focused on the mission, then maybe I wouldn't have to face what I was really doing. But now, all I can see are the faces. The people who were just living their lives. People I'll never know. People who'll never forget what we did. The interviewer's final question is spoken softly, almost gently, yet it carries a weight that presses down on Pyotr like a heavy stone. And what do you feel, Pyotr, when you see those faces? When you hear those voices in the silence? Pyotr's face crumples, the stoic mask shattering completely. His voice trembles, barely holding back the emotion welling up within him. I feel shame, he whispers. I feel regret for everything I did, everything I ignored. I feel like I lost something I can never get back, and I don't know how to live with that. In that moment, Pyotr is stripped bare, left with nothing but the raw truth of his own guilt and the irrevocable harm his choices have caused. The image he once held of himself, of a soldier, of a protector, now lies shattered, replaced by a painful recognition of the lives he has irreparably altered. And as he sits in silence, the weight of his actions settles upon him, leaving him with only the hollow ache of remorse. Pyotr takes a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the floor as he begins to speak, his voice quiet, subdued. I remember the moment I was captured, he says slowly, each word heavy with memory. It was almost like everything went silent. The gunfire stopped, the shouting faded, and there was just this stillness. And in that stillness I felt relief. He hesitates, as if struggling to put his feelings into words. I had spent so long trying to survive, trying to hold on to the purpose I thought I had. But when they took me, it was like it was over. The fear, the struggle, all of it just... The fear, the struggle, all of it just stopped. I was no longer a soldier, no longer following orders. I was just a man. The interviewer listens intently, his expression unreadable as Pyotr continues, his voice tinged with regret. For the first time, I was forced to look back, to see what I had been part of. And as much as I tried to tell myself that it wasn't my fault, that I didn't have a choice, those thoughts, they kept coming back. The faces, the villages, the people we left in ruins. I wanted to shut it out, to ignore it, but I couldn't. He pauses, his jaw tightening. And now, sitting here, I feel like my life, my choices, have brought me exactly where I deserve to be. I'm not free, and maybe. That's the price I have to pay for everything I did, everything I ignored. The interviewer's voice is calm, probing. So you believe this is your fate, Pyotr? To be held, to be confined for what you were part of? Pyotr nods slowly, though there's a hint of resistance in his expression. Yes, maybe. Maybe this is where I belong now. But... He falters, the words catching in his throat. But it's hard to accept that everything I did led to this, that I have to live with knowing that my actions, my choices, brought harm. And yet, even now, there's a part of me that wants to believe that it wasn't all my fault. The interviewer's gaze sharpens, detecting the hesitation. So you still hold on to that. Even with everything you've seen, you still struggle to fully accept responsibility. Pyotr's face tightens, his voice a whisper. I want to. I want to believe that I was just following orders, that I didn't have a choice. But deep down, I know that's just an excuse. I made choices. I stayed. I closed my eyes when I should have questioned. And now, I have to live with that. In that moment, Pyotr's words hang heavy in the air, his struggle to reconcile his regret with the lingering refusal to fully admit guilt, creating a tension that leaves him visibly shaken. He is trapped, not only by the walls around him, but by the weight of his own choices, an invisible confinement from which he may never escape. The interviewer watches Pyotr in silence, letting the weight of their conversation settle heavily in the room. After a moment, he begins to speak, his tone measured but firm, a final assessment of everything that has come to light. "Pyotr," he says slowly, "you've told me a story of duty, of loyalty, of following orders. But throughout your story, there are contradictions. Moments where your words don't align with the reality of what happened. You wanted to be seen as a protector, a soldier fighting for a cause. Yet at every turn, the reality you faced, the things you witnessed, they told a different story." He pauses, allowing the words to settle in the air before continuing. "You speak of loyalty, of brotherhood with your comrades, of a mission you believed in. But when confronted with the pain and devastation left in your wake, you shift your story. Justifications, deflections, attempts to distance yourself from responsibility. You talk about being trapped, about not having a choice, but in every choice you made, you chose to look away, to follow blindly, to ignore the suffering of those you claim to protect." The interviewer leans in, his gaze unwavering, unyielding. There's a moment in each story you've shared, Pyotr, where you were presented with a choice. You saw civilians hiding in fear, mothers pulling their children close, families left shattered. And each time, you told yourself you had no choice, that it was simply part of the mission. Oh, but what was that mission really? Was it to protect, or was it to impose? Pyotr shifts uncomfortably, his face contorted with the weight of the words. The interviewer's tone softens slightly, though his words retain their edge. "The people you encountered, those civilians, those Ukrainian families, they weren't just casualties of war. They were lives, families. People who never asked for your protection. People who were left to pick up the pieces after you had gone. And while you may have told yourself that you were doing something noble, those faces, those broken lives, they reveal a different truth." He lets his words settle, the silence pressing down on both of them. "This story you've told yourself, this version where you were simply following orders, where you didn't have a choice, it's a shield, Pyotr. A shield to protect yourself from the truth, to avoid facing the impact of your actions. But now, sitting here, you can't hide behind that shield any longer. Now you have to face who you became, and what that means." Another silence stretches between them, thick and weighted. The interviewer's final words are softer, yet cut even deeper. "And maybe, just maybe," he adds, his voice barely above a whisper, "the greatest tragedy here is that you had the chance to choose a different path, to question, to refuse. And each time, you turned away. And now, all that's left is to confront the damage that your choices, your silence, and your obedience have left behind." In that quiet, unflinching assessment, the interviewer leaves Pyotr exposed, without defense, forced to confront the contradictions of his own story, a story that now stands as a testament to the dangers of blind obedience, the cost of unchecked loyalty, and the lives left broken in its wake. A heavy silence fills the room as Pyotr sits, eyes lowered, shoulders slumped under the weight of his own story. The interviewer lets the quiet stretch, then, after a long pause, speaks in a low, steady voice. "Pyotr," he begins, "after everything you've said, after the justifications, the regrets, and the choices you chose not to question, what do you see now? When you look back, do you still see a soldier bound by duty? Or do you see something else?" Pyotr takes a deep breath, his gaze distant, his voice soft and unsteady. "I see. Someone who thought he was protecting something, but instead, I became part of something I didn't understand. I see. The faces of people I left behind, and I wonder, what would I do if I could go back?" The interviewer's expression remains still, unreadable. "And what would you do, Pyotr?" Pyotr's voice is barely a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe I would have questioned more, thought harder about what I was doing. But it's too late for that now. All I can do is remember, and live with it." A pause hangs between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then, in a quiet voice, the interviewer leaves him with a final question, one that lingers in the air like an echo. "Is that enough, Pyotr? To live with it? Or will the weight of those choices remain with you long after the war is over?" The camera holds on Pyotr, his face pale, his eyes cast down as he grapples with a question that may never have an answer. And as the screen fades to black, viewers are left with the haunting reality of his words, a reminder of the human cost of war, the burden of choices made and left unmade, and the lingering shadow of responsibility that remains.